Welcome to this mini lecture on school finance. Public schooling in the United States is funded by taxpayer dollars. So, in this presentation, we'll be looking at government roles in school funding. By roles, I mean the various funding streams and responsibilities at federal, state, and local levels. Let's think back to our work on the purposes of education and a little bit on our history. Do you remember that early Americans felt educated citizens were necessary to make our society work? At that time, it was probably more about participation in a free and democratic society that relied on the premise that to be a democracy, citizens needed to be actively engaged. They needed to know something about the leaders and the issues. We also know that what was meant by the term citizen was narrowly defined as white male property owners, and that meaning has slowly changed over the centuries with mixed success. I would argue today that make society work has an emphasis on employment and the idea that society needs employed citizens who make the economy function. Does that mean school is about getting people to work? That's for you to decide. Nevertheless, let's take a look at this chart with data derived from the US Census. We can see here, and I'm sure you've encountered information like this before, that there is a correlation between the level of education, employment, and income. Here, we're looking at household income by level of education attainment of the householder, which is probably the owner or renter or parent. We might infer that education attainment then affects the whole family or the whole group living in the household, including children. Let's return to school funding and consider the federal government's role in education. We have mentioned before that federal issues involve civil rights, access to schooling, and assessments for accountability purposes. Therefore, federal dollars are usually tied to one of these issues. For example, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which guaranteed federal funding for schools, aimed to end discrimination by race. Title IX U.S. Code later aimed to end discrimination based on gender. Federal dollars are often tied to issues of diversity, discrimination, and access. Later, with the passing of No Child Left Behind in 2002, we saw the beginning of the era of accountability. Schools were held accountable for the performance of their students, and low performing schools were expected to close the achievement gap or risk losing funding. In some, federal dollars allocated to states often come with regulations on how that money may be spent. That brings us to the state level. States, as you remember, are focused on issues such as funding formulas, which determine how much financing local districts receive. States also govern and regulate teacher licensure and how schools will be assessed and held accountable for student performance. Measures of accountability are primarily student scores on standardized tests. At the federal level, we have the Common Core state standards, but these are not imposed on states. States may choose their own standards of accountability. Virginia opted out of becoming a Common Core state because we already had our SOLs, or standards of learning. All children in Virginia public schools take SOL tests. I'm sure most of you who grew up here have firsthand experience with these tests. Finally, at the local level, we have school boards, which are comprised of elected citizens. This board governs the local school district. The district superintendent is accountable to the school board for the district's performance and expenditures. So, we have three primary sources of public funding in our education system. As we remember from our look at school structure, We don't have one national system, but 50 different systems. We can see in this chart the national average of percent of funding from each source dating back to 1970. Federal funding looks to be about 10%. State funding, which has very slowly increased, looks to be the largest at about 40 to 45%. And local, which looks to be slowly decreasing, began at about 50% and has now become less than the state level. Of course, these three funding streams somehow total 100%, with states being the largest contributors. Let me give you another moment to consider this. What strikes you about the data trend in this graph, which covers 45 years? We'll come back to this question after we view another graph. Here, this figure represents expenditures per pupil from 1970 through 2015. It's not broken down by source, so I don't know if it's federal, state, or local. And we also have two different ways to compute it because the formulas had changed. However, back in 1970, we can see cost per pupil averaged less than $1,000, which might be more like $5,000 in the 2016 way of computing it. 45 years later, in 2015, the average cost per pupil, regardless of how you calculate it, is closer to $11,000 or more than double what it was 45 years ago. We might speculate some reasons for this increase, but let's step back and instead look at the trend in the data for a moment. What strikes you about the trend here? Let me flip back to the other graph for a moment, and then we'll come back. What is the trend here? What is the trend here? Do you find it interesting that the funding percent has remained fairly constant for the past 45 years, while costs have consistently risen? Put another way, the costs of education have continued to rise for many different reasons, but states continue to be the primary funder, with local governments contributing actually less and the federal government remaining constant. Let's take a closer look at some of the big expenses that contribute to the cost of educating a student. Here are some of the big expenses in school budgets. First, we have teachers and their salaries. Increasingly, we have a need for specialized teachers, and the number of teachers needs to increase so we can reduce the student to teacher ratio. Of course, we remember that teacher salaries are not exactly stellar. Many teachers argue that they are underpaid. And way back at the beginning of the course, we learned that parents today don't even want their children to become teachers. Moving on, we have support services, which include transportation and food. Next, instruction, where there are expenses for materials, including those requiring technology. We have special programs and special education, aids, and so on. We also have administration and capital expenses, which include the cost of running all of these programs, the buildings, and their maintenance. And finally, we have the cost of the assessments of themselves, which have become increasingly have become the focus of accountability. Most of the standardized tests require computers and software, as well as administration and oversight. So, what does all of this do for us? Where are we going? We might come back to this big question. Does the way we, the public, support and vote to fund school align with our broader purposes of education? How has that purpose evolved over the years? Is the purpose of school to create workers, educated citizens? Is it for personal growth, social mobility? Is it to make the economy work? Is it some combination of all of these things? How do our purposes align then with the way funding is allocated? The textbook authors, Kaplan and Owings, discuss the issues of equality, equity, and adequacy in school financing. Here, equality means funding is such that all students receive the same services regardless of student or local needs. Equity means funding for services that students and localities actually need. And adequacy means, and I'm quoting this from the textbook, teach the average student to state standards and then identify how much more is needed to teach students with special needs. Adequacy is a fiscal concept, the authors argue, that is values driven, meaning that someone or some group must decide subjectively. So I'm ending this mini lecture, as I often do or try to do, by raising important questions and then leaving you to do further reading and viewing so that you can become more informed on the topic.